My husband's mistress sat directly across from me at the formal dining table, deliberately running her hand over her perfectly flat stomach. She was supposedly pregnant with twins, but the real shock was not her smug smile or my husband's cowardly silence. It was my mother-in-law sliding a cashier's check for $9 million across the cold marble table, right next to a thick stack of divorce papers. "Take it, sign it, and vanish," she told me, her voice dripping with absolute disdain. "This family needs a bloodline heir to secure the generational trust fund, not a barren womb." I did not scream. I did not burst into tears like they expected. Instead, I reached into my purse and pulled out my pen, completely unaware that the very money they used to buy my absence would soon become the exact weapon I used to dismantle their entire empire. "My name is Camille, and I am 32 years old. I work as a forensic accountant, a career where I spend my days tracking hidden money and untangling financial fraud for high net worth clients." But nothing could have prepared me for the calculated betrayal sitting inside my own marriage. The devastating reality of my marriage shattered on a pristine Sunday evening in Buckhead, Atlanta. Growing up in a working-class neighborhood on the south side of the city, I never imagined I would one day sit in a dining room dripping with crystal chandeliers and imported silk drapes. My mother-in-law, Vivian, was the formidable matriarch of a highly influential real estate and logistics family. She ran her household the exact same way she ran her corporate boardroom, with an iron fist and zero room for dissent. Every Sunday, attendance at her massive estate for dinner was mandatory. It was a weekly ritual designed to remind everyone exactly who held the purse strings and who controlled the family legacy. That particular Sunday felt incredibly strange from the moment I walked through the double mahogany doors. The usual chaotic chatter of the household staff was completely absent. The grand dining table was set for only a few people instead of the usual massive crowd. Donovan, my husband of 5 years, was already seated when I arrived. He refused to make eye contact with me, keeping his gaze firmly fixed on his untouched water glass. Sitting next to him was Lexi. Lexi was a 26-year-old social media influencer who had been orbiting our social circle for the past year. I had always suspected Donovan was inappropriately close to her, but he constantly gaslighted me, claiming she was just a brand ambassador for one of their new luxury apartment developments and that I was being overly paranoid. Seeing her sitting at my mother-in-law's formal dining table, completely relaxed and sipping sparkling water, made the air leave my lungs. But I absolutely refused to show any weakness. I walked forward with my head held high and took my usual seat opposite Donovan. Vivian sat at the head of the table wearing a tailored designer suit even on a Sunday evening. She looked at me like I was a piece of trash that had carelessly blown onto her perfectly manicured lawn. The silence in the room was heavy and suffocating. No food was served. The expensive porcelain plates were completely empty. Vivian folded her hands on the table and looked directly into my eyes. She did not bother with pleasantries or small talk. She simply stated that my marriage was over. She announced clearly and proudly that Lexi was expecting twin boys. Donovan finally looked up, his face a pathetic mask of fake guilt and overwhelming relief. He muttered a weak apology, claiming he needed a legacy and that he had to do what was best for the family name because time was running out. Vivian did not let him finish his pathetic speech. She slammed her hand down on the table, demanding total silence. Then she picked up a large manila envelope and pulled out the divorce papers. She placed them down forcefully on the marble surface. On top of the legal documents, she laid a cashier's check. I could see the zeros clearly printed on the bank paper, $9 million. Vivian leaned forward, her voice echoing coldly in the large room. She told me that I was a complete failure as a wife. She reminded me of my 5 years of painful fertility struggles, the endless doctor appointments, the hormone injections, and the tears I had cried in private. She weaponized my deepest, most vulnerable pain right there in front of my husband's mistress. She explained that the grandfather's trust fund, a massive fortune worth over $150 million, had ironclad legal stipulations. The trust could only be unlocked and distributed by the legal guardian of a born, verified blood heir. She looked at me with pure venom and stated that the family needed a legitimate bloodline heir, not a barren womb that drained their resources. She told me to take the $9 million, sign the papers, and disappear to another country where they would never have to look at my face again. Lexi smirked, her perfectly glossed lips curving into a victorious, arrogant smile. She dramatically placed both hands on her stomach, looking at me with overwhelming fake pity. I felt a surge of pure rage burning in my chest, but I forced my heart rate to slow down. I took a deep breath. In a matter of seconds, my mind shifted from the heartbroken, betrayed wife to the cold, calculating forensic accountant. Before I could even speak, my sister-in-law, Tasha, walked into the dining room. Tasha was 30 years old, proudly unemployed, and entirely dependent on her mother's generous monthly allowance. She pulled out a chair, laughing softly, as she looked at the divorce papers sitting in front of me. Tasha crossed her arms and told me I should be incredibly grateful for this handout. She sneered that $9 million was more money than my entire Southside neighborhood would see in a lifetime. She told me I could finally go buy the whole ghetto and pretend to be a queen because I never truly belonged in their high society generational wealth world. She called me a basic gold digger who failed to secure the bag by producing a child. The insults rained down on me, but a strange, powerful sense of clarity washed over my brain. I looked at the man I had loved and supported for almost a decade. Donovan was a vice president at the family company, supposedly the golden child of the dynasty. But I knew the actual truth behind closed doors. I knew he was incredibly incompetent. I knew he relied entirely on my financial expertise to fix his massive accounting errors every single quarter so his mother would not fire him. He was nothing without the safety net his wealthy family provided. And right now, he was letting his mother, his sister, and his mistress brutally humiliate his wife because he was too weak and spineless to stand up for himself. I reached out and calmly picked up the cashier's check. I did not look at the zeros or act impressed by the amount. Instead, my trained eyes immediately looked at the issuing bank and the subtle routing codes printed at the bottom of the slip. The funds were drawn from a highly specific corporate emergency reserve account. I recognized the account numbers instantly because I was the very person who audited that specific bank profile just last year. Vivian had bypassed the board of directors and illegally pulled corporate liquidity to pay off her son's mistakes. She had literally embezzled company funds to buy my silence and get rid of me quickly. It was a massive federal offense, and she had just handed me the physical documented proof. I placed the check back down on the table, carefully smoothing out the edges. I looked at Vivian, then at Donovan, and finally at Lexi. I pulled my phone out of my purse and dialed my private attorney. I put the phone on speaker and set it on the marble table so everyone could hear. The phone rang twice before my lawyer answered. I instructed him to immediately open a secure offshore trust in Switzerland under a discreet corporate shell name. I read off the routing numbers from Vivian's cashier's check, loud and clear, and told him to initiate an emergency wire transfer the exact second I walked out the door. Vivian's eyes narrowed in sudden confusion. She demanded to know what I was doing and who I was talking to. I completely ignored her and reached into my designer bag for my heavy fountain pen. I did not hesitate for a single second. I did not beg Donovan to reconsider or cry about our wasted years. I uncapped the pen and signed my name on every single line of the divorce agreement. My signature was perfectly steady, bold, and final. Lexi seemed totally confused by my complete lack of emotion. She had clearly prepared herself for a dramatic screaming match, expecting a desperate, hysterical wife begging for her husband to stay. Instead, she was watching a highly educated professional execute a flawless business transaction. Donovan looked deeply uncomfortable. He shifted nervously in his leather seat, suddenly realizing that the woman he was throwing away was not breaking down, but rather adapting instantly. When I finished signing the final page, I stacked the heavy legal documents neatly and pushed them back across the table toward Vivian. I picked up the cashier's check, folded it carefully, and placed it securely in my wallet. I stood up, smoothing the wrinkles from my dress, standing tall and proud. The absolute silence in the dining room was deafening. No one moved a muscle. I looked down at Vivian. I told her that $9 million was an incredibly cheap price to pay for my permanent freedom from this toxic, pathetic excuse for a family. I looked directly at Donovan and told him he was making the absolute biggest financial mistake of his entire life, and that he would soon realize exactly how much of his fake corporate success was built solely on my quiet, uncredited labor. Finally, I turned my attention to Lexi. I looked at her stomach and smiled genuinely. I told her I sincerely hoped the twin boys brought her everything she deserved because she was going to need a massive amount of luck surviving the inevitable bankruptcy of the weak man sitting next to her. I turned on my heel and walked out of the formal dining room. I did not look back once as I walked down the long, luxurious hallway, listening to the sharp, confident click of my heels echoing off the marble floors. I stepped out into the warm Atlanta night, letting the heavy southern breeze hit my face. I climbed into my car, started the engine, and drove away from the sprawling estate without a single tear falling from my eyes. I felt a profound, overwhelming sense of liberation. I had $9 million in untraceable funds, I had my professional dignity, and I was finally free from their constant emotional abuse. I drove straight to the airport, fully intending to spend the next few months completely disappearing in Europe to heal and regroup. But fate had a very different plan for me. The universe was about to hand me the ultimate wild card. As I boarded my flight to Paris later that night, completely ready to start a brand new chapter of my life, I had absolutely no idea that my own body was carrying the biggest secret of all. A secret that would completely shatter Vivian's precious bloodline rule and bring their entire corrupt, arrogant empire crashing down straight into the palm of my hand. Sitting in the first-class cabin of the overnight flight to Paris, I watched the sprawling city lights of Atlanta fade into the dark clouds below. The steady hum of the jet engines should have lulled me to sleep, but my mind was completely consumed by the final conversation I had with Donovan just an hour before I drove to the airport. I had marched upstairs to our massive master bedroom to pack a single leather suitcase with my most important documents, my laptop, and a few essential clothes. I left behind all the expensive jewelry and designer gowns his mother had bought me to parade around at their charity galas. I wanted nothing that belonged to their toxic money. Donovan had followed me up the grand staircase like a pathetic lost puppy. He had carefully closed the bedroom door behind him, desperate to keep his mother from hearing us in the hallway. He stood near the doorway, awkwardly rubbing the back of his neck, trying to play the sympathetic good guy. He used his softest, most manipulative voice, the exact same tone he used when he needed me to fix his accounting disasters. "Camille, please try to understand," he whispered, stepping closer but keeping a safe distance from my suitcase. "I never wanted to hurt you. You are a brilliant woman, and I will always care about you. But I am the vice president of this company. I just need a legacy. A man in my position needs a bloodline to carry on the family name and secure the trust fund. You know how my mother is. My hands are completely tied." I stopped folding my blazer and turned to face him. The sheer audacity of his words made me laugh out loud. I looked him up and down, feeling nothing but profound pity and total disgust. "A legacy?" I asked, my voice deadly calm. "What exactly are you passing down, Donovan? Your inability to read a basic balance sheet, or your remarkable talent for hiding behind your mother whenever the board of directors asks you a difficult question?" He flinched, his fake, sympathetic expression instantly dropping. I took a step toward him, completely dismantling his fragile ego piece by piece. "Let us talk about your incredible legacy. 2 years ago, you authorized the Midtown Commercial Development Project without running a proper risk assessment. You almost bankrupted the entire Southern Division, who spent 3 sleepless weeks restructuring the corporate debt so your mother would not publicly humiliate you and strip you of your executive title. I did. Last quarter, you completely botched the logistics merger with the shipping firm. You authorized a $40 million wire transfer to the wrong vendor account, who caught the discrepancy, reversed the transaction, and saved the company from a massive federal audit. I did. I grabbed my passport from the bedside table and threw it into my designer tote bag. "You do not have a legacy, Donovan. You have a title that you did not earn and a massive paycheck that I mathematically justified for you every single fiscal quarter. You are a figurehead. And now, you are trading the only person who actually protected your career for a 26-year-old social media influencer who cannot even spell logistics. You think those twin boys are going to inherit a real estate empire? By the time you are done running that company without my forensic audits covering your tracks, there will be nothing left for them to inherit but massive corporate debt and federal tax penalties. He stood there completely paralyzed, his jaw tight with silent fury and deep shame. He knew I was entirely right. He stepped aside and I walked past him, rolling my suitcase out the door and out of his life forever. The memory of his defeated face faded as the flight attendant offered me a glass of champagne. I politely declined, requesting sparkling water instead. My stomach had been feeling unusually unsettled since the dinner, which I had simply chalked up to the extreme stress and adrenaline of the evening. When I finally landed at Charles de Gaulle Airport, the crisp European air felt like a completely clean slate. I had pre-booked a stunning penthouse suite at a luxury hotel overlooking the Seine River. The $9 million sitting quietly in my offshore account provided a comforting blanket of absolute security. I intended to spend my days visiting museums, eating incredible food, and planning my next brilliant career move. I wanted to completely erase the memory of the Atlanta elite and the suffocating grip of my mother-in-law. But my body had a completely different agenda. On my third morning in Paris, I woke up feeling violently ill. The lavish bedroom spun wildly as I rushed to the cold marble bathroom, gripping the edges of the sink as a wave of intense nausea crashed over me. I splashed freezing cold water on my face, staring at my pale reflection in the mirror. At first, I blamed the rich French cuisine and the severe jet lag, but the nausea did not fade. It returned the next morning and the morning after that, accompanied by a strange, profound exhaustion that settled deep into my bones. My period was late. Extremely late. A cold realization washed over me, freezing the blood in my veins. I quickly put on a heavy trench coat, walked down the cobblestone street to a local pharmacy, and bought 3 different brands of pregnancy tests. I rushed back to my hotel suite, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I took the tests, lined them up neatly on the bathroom counter, and waited. Those 3 minutes felt like an absolute eternity. I paced the floor, my mind racing through 1,000 different impossibilities. Donovan and I had tried for years to conceive. We had visited the most expensive exclusive fertility clinics in Atlanta. The elite doctors had gently explained that the chances of a natural conception were virtually zero. I had internalized that failure. I had let Vivian and Tasha tear my self-worth to shreds over it, enduring their constant whispers about my barren womb at every family gathering. The timer on my phone chimed softly, breaking my train of thought. I walked over to the counter and looked down. 2 solid pink lines on the first test, a bold plus sign on the second, the word pregnant flashing clearly on the digital screen of the third. Positive. All 3 of them. Positive. I sank down onto the edge of the large soaking tub, my hands trembling violently as I held the plastic sticks. A miracle had happened. But as the initial shock began to wear off, a dark, furious realization took its place. The elite fertility doctors in Atlanta were all handpicked by Vivian. They were entirely on the family payroll. For 5 years. They had looked me directly in the eyes and told me that my body was the problem. They had prescribed me intense, painful hormone treatments that wrecked my physical and mental health. They had forced me to carry the heavy, humiliating burden of being the broken wife. But looking at these positive tests, the mathematical truth became glaringly obvious to my analytical mind. The doctors had lied. My body was completely fine. The issue had always been Donovan. He had the low sperm count. He was the one struggling with fertility, but Vivian would never allow her precious golden child to bear the public stigma of imperfection. She could not accept that the heir to her real estate empire was flawed. So she bought the doctors, falsified the medical reports, and shifted the entire blame onto me. They gaslighted me for 5 agonizing years just to protect a weak man's fragile ego and maintain their perfect societal image. And yet, despite all their expensive lies and calculated manipulation, despite Donovan's severe medical shortcomings, a biological miracle had quietly occurred right before they threw me out. I placed a hand gently over my completely flat stomach. The sheer delicious irony of the situation almost made me laugh out loud in the empty bathroom. Vivian had just paid me $9 million to disappear because she desperately wanted a bloodline heir from her son's mistress. She had orchestrated an elaborate, cruel divorce to secure the grandfather's massive trust fund. But the entire time, the only legitimate biological heir to the family empire was already safely growing inside of me. I looked at the pregnancy tests one last time. I did not feel the sudden urge to call Donovan. I did not want to run back to Atlanta, wave these tests in their faces, and claim my rightful place at that toxic dining table. I slowly gathered the plastic sticks and tossed them straight into the bathroom trash can. I looked at myself in the mirror, my posture straightening, my eyes burning with a fierce protective fire. They paid me to vanish. They paid me to walk away. So I will. This child does not belong to the family name. This child does not belong to Donovan. This child belongs to me alone. And with the millions of dollars they foolishly handed me, I was going to make absolutely certain that no one in that family would ever have the power to control our destiny again. The very next morning, I left my luxury hotel suite and walked to a discreet high-end cafe tucked away in the elegant 8th arrondissement of Paris. The crisp morning air felt incredibly refreshing against my skin, a stark contrast to the suffocating atmosphere of Atlanta I had just escaped. I had arranged a private meeting with Julian, a former corporate intelligence officer turned high-end private investigator. Julian specialized in uncovering the dirty, deeply buried secrets of the global elite, and his services did not come cheap. He was already sitting at a corner table when I arrived, sipping a black espresso, a thick encrypted tablet resting perfectly square in front of him. I sat down and slid a sleek black folder across the wooden table. Julian opened it without a word, his sharp eyes rapidly scanning the initial dossier I had prepared regarding my ex-husband Donovan and his tyrannical mother Vivian. Julian looked up from the document, studying my face with a detached professional curiosity. He leaned forward and asked me what exactly I was looking for, noting that most scorned wives in his line of work just wanted high-resolution photos of the mistress to use as leverage in a messy divorce court battle. I looked back at him, my expression completely flat. I told him I already had my signed divorce papers and I had absolutely no interest in petty emotional revenge. I wanted total systemic destruction of their entire empire. Julian raised an eyebrow, genuinely intrigued by my absolute lack of tears. He asked me why I was willing to go to such extreme, calculated lengths against my own former family. That was when the carefully guarded floodgates of my memory finally opened. I looked him dead in the eye and explained the 5 years of absolute psychological torture I had endured under Vivian's roof. I described how she would deliberately schedule massive, lavish family gatherings, specifically on the exact days she knew my latest round of IVF treatments had officially failed. I told him how she would intentionally seat me next to pregnant cousins and heavily pregnant friends of the family, loudly lamenting across the dining table about how her massive family legacy was slowly dying because of my incompetent body. She bought off the most expensive fertility specialists in Atlanta, forcing them to manipulate my medical records to completely hide Donovan's severe biological deficiencies. She forced me to undergo agonizing, completely unnecessary hormone injections that wrecked my physical health, caused my hair to thin, and destroyed my mental stability. She systematically made me believe I was fundamentally broken, less than a real woman, and entirely unworthy of love or basic human respect. She weaponized my deepest, most pure desire to be a mother and used it as a psychological collar to keep me completely submissive to her iron will. Julian listened quietly, his professional demeanor tightening into a look of genuine, unfiltered disgust. He tapped his encrypted tablet, his fingers flying across the screen, and asked me where exactly he should begin digging. I told him to start with Lexi, the 26-year-old social media influencer, playing the role of the triumphant mistress. I wanted every single detail of her life. Her hidden finances, her private associates, and her physical movements over the last 12 to 18 months. If she was carrying twins to miraculously secure the grandfather's massive trust fund, I needed to know exactly who she truly was behind her perfectly curated internet filters. Julian nodded sharply, accepted his massive retainer fee via a secure wire transfer. and vanished into the bustling Parisian crowds to do what he did best. With the investigative leg of my master plan officially in motion, I returned to my penthouse suite to begin the real warfare. Financial warfare. I ordered an elaborate room service breakfast, locked the heavy oak doors of my suite, and opened my high-powered laptop. For a forensic accountant, numbers are never just numbers on a screen. They are a highly detailed, undeniable map of human behavior. They expose every single lie, every hidden motive, and every desperate, panicked move a corrupt person makes in the dark. I currently had $9 million sitting quietly in a temporary offshore account. It was time to give that money a permanent, completely untraceable, and highly aggressive home. Within 48 hours, working entirely through a trusted network of elite European financial attorneys, I established a pristine, legally bulletproof Swiss shell company. I named the entity Apex Holdings. On paper, it appeared to be a ruthless, well-funded European private equity investment firm looking to aggressively expand its American portfolio. In reality, it was my personal financial guillotine carefully and quietly positioned directly over Vivienne's perfectly manicured neck. Once the corporate structure was legally solidified and registered, I transferred the entire $9 million into the main operating accounts of Apex Holdings. Then I began the meticulous process of tracing the exact origin of that massive cashier's check. I logged into my secure cloud backups, pulling up the massive, highly encrypted archives of corporate ledgers I had personally maintained for Donovan's company over the last 5 years. Vivienne thought she was incredibly clever and untouchable by using a bank-issued cashier's check to completely hide the source of the funds. But she severely underestimated the furious intelligence of the woman who had personally designed the company's internal auditing software from scratch. It took me less than 3 hours of cross-referencing spreadsheets to completely crack her hidden routing trail. I followed the digital breadcrumbs through 3 different subsidiary accounts, slicing through her clumsy attempts at financial layering until I found the exact bleeding wound in their corporate structure. Vivienne had not used her own massive personal wealth to pay me off. She did not even use Donovan's bloated executive bonus structure. Instead, she had illegally bypassed the company board of directors, forged 2 executive signature authorizations, and drained exactly $9 million directly from the commercial real estate firm's restricted emergency reserve fund. It was a blatant, arrogant act of massive corporate embezzlement. She had literally stolen millions of dollars from her own private investors to quickly cover up her son's scandalous affair and hastily secure her precious bloodline before anyone could ask questions. If the board of directors or the federal financial regulators found out about this unauthorized withdrawal, Vivienne would face immediate criminal prosecution, massive public humiliation, and decades in a federal prison cell. But I had absolutely no intention of calling the authorities. Turning her into the police would be far too easy and completely unsatisfying. I did not just want her in a jail cell, I wanted to legally own every single thing she valued. I poured myself a glass of cold, sparkling water, rubbing my slightly aching stomach as my morning sickness flared up again, a constant reminder of the beautiful secret growing inside me. I pushed through the nausea and pulled up the family company's current debt portfolio. Because Donovan was a wildly incompetent vice president who relied entirely on my brains to survive, the company was dangerously leveraged. They relied on massive, high-interest loans from predatory secondary private equity firms to keep their bloated commercial real estate projects afloat. These specific lenders were ruthless, and the loans were deeply secured by the family's most valuable physical assets, including their towering corporate headquarters in downtown Atlanta and Vivienne's sprawling luxury estate in Buckhead. I carefully targeted their 3 most toxic, high-risk loans. These were complex financial instruments loaded with strict performance covenants that Donovan was actively failing to meet because he no longer had me fixing his quarterly projections. Operating under the heavy corporate veil of Apex Holdings, I reached out directly to the private equity firms holding those loans. I offered to buy those specific debt packages entirely off their hands for a lump sum of instant cash, using the very $9 million Vivienne had foolishly stolen to get rid of me. The lenders, eager to quickly offload Donovan's incredibly risky and underperforming debt from their own books, jumped at my aggressive European offer. Over the next 2 weeks, while I sat comfortably in a Parisian cafe eating warm croissants and feeling my baby grow stronger every single day, my Swiss shell company quietly and ruthlessly purchased over $15 million of the family's corporate debt at a massive discount. The highly complex legal paperwork was drafted, finalized, sealed, and rendered completely untraceable to my real identity. I closed my laptop and leaned back in my plush chair, a slow, incredibly dangerous smile spreading across my face as I looked out over the Eiffel Tower. I was no longer the discarded barren wife they could easily brush under the rug. I was no longer the quiet, obedient accountant fixing their endless mistakes in the shadows. Through the unstoppable legal force of Apex Holdings, I had just silently become the absolute majority debt holder of their entire corporate empire. I literally owned the mortgage on Vivienne's precious elite mansion. I owned the debt securing their flagship commercial properties. If they missed a single scheduled payment, or if I decided to aggressively call the loans due based on the hidden embezzlement I could expose at any given second, I could legally seize absolutely everything they had built over 3 generations of wealth. Vivienne had paid me $9 million to walk away and leave her perfect empire alone. Instead, I used her own stolen money to quietly buy the very ground she walked on. The trap was now perfectly set, waiting silently in the shadows. All I had to do was wait for them to make their next foolish, arrogant move. I did not have to wait long. While I was enjoying the crisp autumn air and quiet mornings in Paris, the atmosphere back in Atlanta was rapidly turning toxic. The heavy southern humidity was nothing compared to the suffocating tension building inside Vivienne's sprawling estate. The family that had proudly stood united to throw me out into the street was already beginning to turn on each other, entirely driven by their own greed and massive egos. The first major crack in their perfect facade appeared in the estate's lavish glass conservatory. Lexi had completely moved in, taking over my former master bedroom and treating the household staff like her personal servants. She sat on a plush velvet sofa surrounded by stacks of elite bridal magazines and fabric swatches. Across from her stood Tasha gripping an expensive leather-bound tablet. Vivienne had unfortunately tasked Tasha with managing the budget for the upcoming wedding, a massive mistake that instantly ignited a vicious power struggle between the two deeply insecure women. Lexi casually tossed a glossy brochure for a private island honeymoon onto the glass coffee table. She demanded a $2 million wedding budget. She wanted a custom designer gown imported directly from Milan, a celebrity performer for the reception and private jet transportation for 20 of her closest social media influencer friends. She spoke with a ridiculous level of entitlement, acting as if she had personally built the family fortune from the ground up. Tasha stared at her, her face twisting into a mask of pure disgust. She tapped the screen of her tablet aggressively and informed Lexi that the family was not going to liquidate actual real estate assets just to fund a glorified photo shoot for Instagram. Tasha reminded Lexi that she was nothing more than a temporary placeholder, a cheap distraction Donovan picked up to serve a biological purpose. Tasha sneered, telling Lexi she should be grateful they were even allowing her to marry into high society, and that she needed to cut her ridiculous demands in half before Vivienne found out and canceled the entire spectacle. Lexi did not cry or back down. Instead, she leaned back against the velvet cushions and offered a slow, incredibly wicked smile. She gently placed both hands over her stomach, fully weaponizing her pregnancy. Lexi looked Tasha up and down, her eyes completely cold. She stated that she was carrying the next generation of the empire, the twin boys who would legally unlock a trust fund worth over $150 million. Lexi calmly pointed out that Tasha was a 30-year-old woman who still needed an allowance from her mother just to buy groceries. Tasha turned red with absolute fury. She opened her mouth to scream, but Lexi held up a perfectly manicured hand to silence her. Lexi lowered her voice to a dangerous, mocking whisper. She told Tasha she should spend significantly less time worrying about a $2 million wedding budget and much more time worrying about her own husband. Lexi stared directly into Tasha's eyes and casually mentioned an exclusive underground VIP nightclub located deep in downtown Atlanta. She asked Tasha if Malik had told her he was working late last Friday night. Tasha completely froze, her aggressive posture instantly crumbling. Lexi continued, her voice dripping with poison. She told Tasha she knew exactly which private room Malik was in, exactly how much cash he was throwing around, and exactly which bottle girl he took home. Lexi leaned forward, the threat hanging heavily in the warm air of the conservatory. She told Tasha to approve the $2 million wedding budget immediately, without any further complaints to Vivian, or else the entire family would find out exactly what Malik was doing behind closed doors. Tasha stood there entirely paralyzed, her hands shaking as she gripped her tablet. The arrogant, untouchable sister-in-law who had mocked my working-class background was suddenly trapped by a 26-year-old manipulator. Lexi had confidently marked her territory, completely unaware that she was aggressively fighting for a piece of an empire that I already legally owned. While the women were tearing each other apart inside the mansion, a much larger catastrophic crisis was unfolding 20 miles away at the corporate headquarters. Donovan sat behind his massive mahogany desk in his top-floor executive office, staring blankly at a complex spreadsheet displayed on his computer monitor. He was desperately trying to prepare for an upcoming board meeting. But without my forensic auditing skills to guide him, the numbers looked like an entirely foreign language. His head was pounding. He had spent the last 3 days trying to decipher the quarterly projections I used to finish for him in less than 2 hours. His office phone suddenly blared, making him jump in his expensive leather chair. It was the chief financial officer. Donovan picked up the receiver, expecting a routine update on their new Midtown commercial development. Instead, the CFO sounded completely breathless, his voice laced with pure, unfiltered panic. The CFO told Donovan to immediately open the secure banking portal and look at their primary revolving credit lines. Donovan frantically clicked through the banking software, his heart dropping directly into his stomach. The massive multi-million-dollar credit line they relied on to pay their construction contractors, fund their daily corporate operations, and keep their heavily leveraged real estate projects moving was entirely frozen. The screen simply flashed a bright red error message citing an immediate halt on all draw requests. Donovan demanded to know what was happening, his voice cracking with sudden fear. The CFO explained that their commercial banks were rejecting every single transaction because a massive secondary loan had just been aggressively bought out by an anonymous international firm called Apex Holdings. The CFO's voice trembled as he revealed that Apex Holdings had instantly conducted a ruthless audit of the loan terms and discovered a highly technical, deeply buried covenant breach. Because the company was technically in default on that specific high-risk loan, it triggered a catastrophic chain reaction across their entire financial portfolio. The major banks had frozen all liquidity to protect their own assets. Donovan felt the blood completely drain from his face. He asked the CFO how much money they currently had access to in their liquid operating accounts. The silence on the other end of the line was absolutely deafening. Finally, the CFO whispered that after making the upcoming Friday payroll, the company would be completely broke. They had zero liquidity. They could not fund the Midtown project. They could not pay their commercial vendors. And they absolutely could not write a $2 million check for a lavish luxury wedding without triggering a massive federal audit of their remaining accounts. Donovan hung up the phone, his hands shaking violently. The walls of his luxurious corner office suddenly felt incredibly small, closing in on him from every side. He pulled off his expensive silk tie and threw it across the room, struggling to breathe. For 5 years, I had meticulously managed their cash flow constantly, shielding them from the brutal consequences of their own reckless spending. I had protected them from aggressive lenders and navigated their toxic debt with perfect precision. The very second they forced me out, the fragile shield I had built completely evaporated. He had no idea that Apex Holdings was not some random predatory European firm. He had no idea that the silent assassin destroying his company was the exact same woman he had discarded at the dinner table. Donovan desperately logged back into the banking portal, frantically searching for the specific restricted emergency reserve fund. He thought he could temporarily pull cash from the reserves to unfreeze the credit lines and quiet the panic. He navigated to the secure account and stared at the screen in absolute horror. The account balance was zero. The $9 million that was supposed to be sitting there as their ultimate corporate safety net was completely gone. He stared at the empty ledger, his mind racing, completely failing to realize that his own mother had illegally drained that exact account to pay for my divorce settlement. Donovan buried his face in his hands, a wave of profound, sickening dread washing over his entire body. He was entirely trapped. He had a ruthless, anonymous international firm holding his corporate debt hostage. He had a furious board of directors who would soon demand answers for the frozen credit lines. He had a pregnant mistress demanding a $2 million spectacle. And worst of all, he was going to have to walk into his mother's pristine estate and confess that the generational empire she prized above absolutely everything else was completely out of money. The sweat dripped down his forehead as he stared blindly at the Atlanta skyline through his floor-to-ceiling windows. The arrogant confidence he had displayed when he told me he needed a legacy had entirely vanished. The empire was bleeding out, the family was fracturing from the inside. And the massive financial trap I had carefully engineered from Paris was beginning to snap shut around his throat. All the money, all the status, and all the generational pride in the world could not save them from the brutal mathematical reality of their own destruction. While Donovan was suffocating under the weight of his collapsing corporate empire in Atlanta, my peaceful afternoon in Paris was abruptly interrupted by a quiet, vibrating chime from my encrypted smartphone. I was sitting at a small, sunlit bistro near the Louvre, enjoying a glass of fresh orange juice and reviewing the final legal confirmations from Apex Holdings. The notification icon on my screen was a plain black square, the prearranged digital signal from Julian, my private investigator. He had promised me a full comprehensive dossier on Lexi, and Julian was a man who always delivered ahead of schedule. I paid my bill in cash, gathered my heavy trench coat, and walked briskly back to my hotel. Once inside my penthouse suite, I locked the thick oak doors, drew the heavy blackout curtains, and opened my high-powered laptop. The encrypted email required a dual authentication process and a rolling security token to access. When the file finally decrypted, it revealed a massive digital folder containing bank statements, private direct messages, and a single heavy video file labeled simply with a date from exactly 4 months ago. Julian had attached a brief typed note. It read, "You asked for the truth behind her perfect internet filters. Watch the video first. Pay close attention to the timestamp and the man in the corner." I clicked the video file. The screen flickered to life, displaying high-definition security footage from a heavily guarded underground VIP room. I instantly recognized the dark neon-lit interior. It was The Vault, an ultra-exclusive nightclub, hidden beneath the streets of downtown Atlanta, a place notorious for its strict no-phones policy and its wealthy, reckless clientele. The timestamp glowing brightly in the bottom right corner indicated it was a Friday night, roughly 3 weeks before Lexi officially announced her miraculous pregnancy to Donovan and Vivian. The footage was completely silent, but the visual clarity was exceptional. The private VIP room was bathed in deep red and purple lights. A massive silver champagne bucket sat on a low glass table surrounded by half-empty bottles of premium liquor. Lexi stumbled into the frame wearing a skin-tight designer dress. She was heavily intoxicated, laughing wildly at something off-camera as she threw herself onto the plush leather sofa. She looked completely different from the demure, respectful woman who sat at Vivian's formal dining table, playing the perfect future mother. Here she was, sloppy, arrogant, and entirely out of control. I watched closely, my analytical mind scanning every inch of the frame like a complex balance sheet. I waited to see Donovan walk into the room. I fully expected him to be the one buying the expensive bottles and funding her lavish lifestyle behind my back. But the man who stepped into the camera's view a few seconds later was absolutely not my ex-husband. He was taller, broader, and moved with a distinct, arrogant swagger. He wore a dark, tailored suit jacket over a crisp white shirt, the top 3 buttons casually undone. As he leaned over the glass table to pour another drink, the neon light caught the sharp angles of his face. My breath caught in my throat. I leaned closer to the screen, my eyes narrowing as I stared intensely at the high-resolution image. It was Malik, my brother-in-law, Tasha's husband. I sat back in my chair, my mind struggling to process the visual evidence for a fraction of a second, before the forensic accountant in me took over coldly and clinically analyzing the data. Malik and Lexi were not just casually running into each other at a nightclub. The body language was undeniable and deeply intimate. Malik handed Lexi a glass of champagne, and she immediately wrapped her legs around his waist, pulling him down onto the sofa with her. They kissed with a desperate, sloppy familiarity that proved this was not a one-time drunken mistake. This was an ongoing, deeply entrenched affair. The silent security footage showed Malik's hands aggressively roaming over Lexi's body. He kissed her neck, her chest, and then in a moment that completely solidified my terrifying realization, he placed his large hand flat against her stomach. Lexi covered his hand with her own, throwing her head back in a silent, victorious laugh. I paused the video right at that exact frame. I stared at the frozen image of Malik holding Lexi's stomach. I mentally calculated the dates. 4 months ago, 3 weeks before the pregnancy announcement. The sudden rush to secure the divorce, the twin boys. The realization hit me with the absolute force of a freight train, followed immediately by a wave of pure, unadulterated brilliance. The elite fertility doctors had confirmed years ago that Donovan had a severely low sperm count, making natural conception virtually impossible. Vivian had forced me to take the blame for 5 years. When Lexi suddenly turned up pregnant, Vivian was so desperate to secure the grandfather's trust fund and prove her golden boy's virility that she blindly accepted the miracle without demanding a single DNA test. She assumed Lexi was just another lucky gold digger who hit the biological jackpot with Donovan. But Lexi was not a miracle worker. She was just incredibly calculating. She knew Donovan was rich, but she also knew he was weak and easy to manipulate. Malik, on the other hand, was the director of investment acquisitions for the family firm. He had direct access to massive amounts of liquid cash and a notorious reputation for cheating on Tasha with bottle girls and Instagram models. Lexi had cast a wide net into the family's deep pockets, and she had caught 2 completely different fish. The heirs. The precious twin boys that Vivian was ready to sacrifice my entire marriage to protect. The babies that were supposed to legally unlock a $150 million trust fund. They did not belong to Donovan. They were Malik's children. I let out a low, breathy laugh that echoed loudly in the quiet Parisian penthouse. The absolute staggering hypocrisy of it all was almost poetic. Vivian had paid me $9 million to step aside so her son could proudly raise his sister's husband's illegitimate children. The pure, unblemished bloodline she constantly preached about was a complete and total fraud, corrupted from the inside out by the very man she had welcomed into the family with open arms. I minimized the video and opened the rest of Julian's files. The private investigator had done a masterful job tracing the financial breadcrumbs. There were bank records showing Malik quietly transferring large sums of money into a secret checking account under Lexi's maiden name. There were encrypted text messages where Lexi explicitly threatened to expose Malik to Tasha if he did not help her convince Donovan that the babies were his. Lexi was playing the ultimate long game. She was using Malik's biological twins to trap Donovan into marriage, securing her permanent place in the family mansion and guaranteeing her unlimited access to the generational wealth. Once she was legally married to Donovan, she would have both men entirely under her control. I closed the files and walked over to the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out over the sparkling lights of the city. A slow, incredibly dangerous smile spread across my face. When I first discovered the embezzlement and secretly bought their corporate debt, I had the power to financially ruin them. I could take their buildings, their credit lines, and their luxury cars. But financial ruin was something they could potentially recover from over time. They could declare bankruptcy, restructure the firm, and eventually rebuild their wealthy facade. But this video was entirely different. This was total, undeniable social and emotional annihilation. Vivian's entire identity was built on the absolute superiority of her family name. Tasha's entire ego was built on her status as a loyal, wealthy wife who constantly looked down on others. Donovan's entire fragile manhood was currently resting on the firm belief that he had finally proven his fertility and secured his legacy. With one single click of a button, I could shatter every single illusion they held dear. I could turn their perfect elite dining table into an absolute bloodbath of betrayal and public humiliation. I walked back to my laptop and carefully copied the video file, the bank transfers, and the text messages onto 3 separate highly encrypted thumb drives. I placed one securely in my hotel safe, slipped one into my designer purse, and uploaded the third to a secure cloud server that only I could access. I was holding a nuclear bomb, and I had absolutely no intention of detonating it from a safe distance across the ocean. A revelation of this massive magnitude required a very specific stage. It required a live audience. It required the perfect moment of maximum arrogance before the absolute fall. I rubbed my stomach gently, feeling a deep, fiercely protective bond with the child growing inside me. The only actual legitimate heir to the family empire was safe in Paris, thousands of miles away from their toxic lies. While they were busy tearing each other apart over fake legacies and stolen money, I was quietly preparing to claim everything that was rightfully mine. I sat back on the plush sofa, letting the sheer magnitude of my leverage wash over me. In my profession, leverage is everything. It is the invisible currency that dictates exactly who wins and who loses in the boardroom. Lexi thought she was a master manipulator because she had successfully fooled Donovan and blackmailed Malik. She thought her pregnancy was her golden ticket. But Lexi was playing simple checkers while I was playing three-dimensional chess. She had completely failed to account for the forensic accountant who had just been handed unlimited resources and a massive motive for absolute destruction. I opened my email and booked a first-class ticket back to Atlanta. I did not know exactly when the wedding was taking place, but given the sudden catastrophic freeze on their corporate credit lines and Donovan's desperate need for cash, I knew Vivian would aggressively push to move the ceremony up as quickly as possible. She needed that grandfather's trust fund unlocked immediately to save her collapsing company. The stage was perfectly set. The actors were all completely blind to the trap closing around them. I packed my leather suitcase, making sure to leave plenty of room for the custom-tailored, devastatingly elegant black gown I had just purchased from an exclusive Parisian boutique. I was going back to Atlanta, not as the broken, discarded wife they thought they had paid off, but as the apex predator they had foolishly created. The game of shadows was officially over. It was time to step directly into the light and watch their entire fake empire burn to the ground. The return flight to Atlanta felt entirely different from my journey to Paris. This time I was not escaping. I was hunting. As the plane cruised high above the Atlantic Ocean, I sipped sparkling water and reviewed the latest financial reports my Swiss attorneys had forwarded to me. The pressure cooker I had carefully constructed around Donovan's company was officially reaching its boiling point. Back in Atlanta, the walls were rapidly closing in on my ex-husband. The corporate headquarters, usually bustling with arrogant executives and high-powered meetings, felt more like a sinking ship. The frozen credit lines had completely paralyzed their operations. Contractors on the massive Midtown project had officially walked off the job site due to unpaid invoices. Several key investors were aggressively demanding an emergency board meeting to address the sudden, terrifying lack of liquidity. Donovan was completely out of his depth. He had spent the last 48 hours frantically calling every single contact in his phone, desperately trying to secure bridge loans or temporary cash infusions. But the Atlanta business world is surprisingly small, and rumors of his severe financial distress had already spread like wildfire. No one wanted to throw good money into a sinking real estate empire that was actively defaulting on its primary covenants. Desperation finally drove Donovan to the one place he always went when he needed to be rescued. He drove his sleek black sports car up the winding driveway of Vivian's Buckhead estate, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. He stormed past the household staff and found his mother sitting in the formal library, casually reading the Wall Street Journal while sipping her morning tea. Donovan did not bother with pleasantries. He paced frantically back and forth across the expensive Persian rug, his voice rising in sheer panic. He told his mother that the company was bleeding out. He explained that an anonymous international firm called Apex Holdings had aggressively bought up their most toxic debt and successfully frozen their primary credit lines based on a deeply buried technical default. He practically begged Vivian to help him, his voice cracking with fear, as he admitted they could not even make payroll by the end of the week. Vivian slowly lowered her newspaper, her face a mask of cold, calculating fury. She demanded to know how a foreign entity had managed to completely outmaneuver him right under his nose. Donovan defensively shot back that she had fired the only person who actually understood their complex debt structures. He reminded her that I was the one who always protected them from predatory lenders, and without me, the entire finance department was running completely blind. Vivienne stood up sharply, refusing to accept any blame. She told Donovan to stop acting like a helpless child. She ordered him to simply tap into the massive emergency corporate reserve fund to unfreeze the credit lines. Donovan froze, his face turning pale. He swallowed hard and told his mother the truth. He confessed that he had already tried to access the reserves. But the account was completely empty. The $9 million was gone. For the first time in her life, Vivian actually looked panicked. Her sharp eyes darted away from her son as the undeniable reality of her own massive crime finally caught up with her. She knew exactly where that money was. She had illegally embezzled it to buy my silence and secure her precious bloodline. But she could absolutely never admit that to Donovan or to the board of directors. Without facing immediate federal prison time, Donovan fell to his knees in front of his mother's leather chair, completely breaking down. He begged her to prematurely unlock the grandfather's massive trust fund. He pleaded with her to release just a fraction of the $150 million to save the family business from total collapse. He promised he would pay it back the moment the Midtown project was completed. Vivian looked down at her completely broken son, her expression hardening back into its usual ruthless mask. She coldly and firmly refused. She stated the ironclad legal clause that governed the massive fortune. She reminded him that the trust could absolutely only be accessed and distributed by the legal guardian of a born verified blood heir. She told him that his grandfather had deliberately structured the trust that way to prevent weak, incompetent family members from draining the wealth to cover their own massive failures. She could not legally touch a single penny of that money until Lexi physically gave birth to those twin boys. Donovan buried his face in his hands, completely defeated. He sobbed, asking his mother what they were supposed to do. He told her the company would be completely insolvent and forced into bankruptcy within a matter of days. The public humiliation would destroy their family name forever. Vivian paced the library, her brilliant, twisted mind working furiously to find a solution. She knew they needed to project an image of absolute strength and financial stability to the panicked board of directors and the aggressive lenders. They needed a massive public distraction to buy them time. They needed to legally secure Lexi to the family before anyone realized the company was actually broke. Vivienne stopped pacing and turned to Donovan. Her voice was sharp and commanding. She ordered him to move the wedding up. Not next month. Not next week. She demanded that the extravagant $2 million wedding take place that very weekend. Donovan looked up at her, completely stunned. He argued that they had absolutely no liquid cash to pay the luxury vendors, the exclusive caterers, or the elite florists. Vivian waved her hand dismissively. She told him she would personally leverage the very last of her private unsecured credit lines to fund the spectacle. She explained her desperate strategy. A massive, highly publicized luxury wedding would instantly signal to the wealthy Atlanta investors that the family was still incredibly prosperous and entirely unbothered by the rumors. It would legally lock Lexi into the family, guaranteeing that her twin boys, the supposed keys to the trust fund, belonged exclusively to the empire. Vivian told Donovan to stop crying, put his expensive suit back on, and go play the role of the triumphant wealthy groom. She promised him that once the wedding was over and the babies were born, they would unlock the grandfather's millions and crush this anonymous Apex Holdings firm forever. Lexi was absolutely thrilled when Vivian delivered the news. She immediately launched into full bridezilla mode, screaming at her wedding planners and terrorizing Tasha to execute the $2 million event in less than 4 days. Lexi felt completely victorious. She thought she had successfully manipulated the most powerful family in Atlanta and secured her permanent place in high society. She had absolutely no idea that the rushed wedding was actually a desperate, pathetic smokescreen to hide their massive impending bankruptcy. And neither of them had any idea that I was already on my way back. I landed at Hartsfield-Jackson Airport late Thursday night. The familiar, heavy, humid air of my hometown hit me as I stepped out of the terminal and slid into the back of a private black SUV I had prearranged. I did not go anywhere near the affluent neighborhoods of Buckhead or the corporate high-rises of Midtown. Instead, I directed the driver to a discreet, high-security luxury hotel downtown. I settled into my suite and immediately connected with my legal team in Switzerland via an encrypted video call. The timing could not have been more completely perfect. Vivian's desperate decision to move the wedding up to this weekend played exactly into my hands. By aggressively draining the very last of her private credit lines to fund a $2 million party, she had completely eliminated any remaining financial safety net she possessed. She had literally cornered herself. My lead attorney, a brilliant corporate shark named Elias, confirmed that the highly complex legal paperwork for the hostile debt takeover was completely finalized. We now legally owned the primary mortgage on the corporate headquarters. We held the high-interest bridge loans securing Vivian's massive personal estate. We were the undisputed masters of their financial destiny. Elias asked me if I wanted him to formally file the default notices with the federal courts the next morning. I smiled, looking at the glowing Atlanta skyline through my hotel window. I told Elias to hold the filings. I did not want to send them a sterile legal document through the mail. I wanted to deliver the absolute destruction of their empire in person. I opened my suitcase and carefully hung up my custom-tailored black Parisian gown. It was a masterpiece of high-end design, featuring sharp, structured shoulders and a flowing, elegant drape that perfectly concealed the slight curve of my 5-month pregnancy. I was not going to crash their wedding looking like a desperate, scorned ex-wife. I was going to walk into their incredibly expensive, highly publicized charade looking exactly like the billionaire corporate raider who literally owned the roof over their heads. The trap was fully armed. The financial noose was pulled incredibly tight, and Malik's deeply destructive secret was burning a hole in my pocket, ready to completely obliterate their fake, pure bloodline. I poured myself a glass of cold water, gently resting my hand on my stomach. The stage was finally set for the ultimate reckoning. Tomorrow night was the exclusive rehearsal dinner, and I had absolutely every intention of being the guest of honor they never saw coming. The Pinnacle was arguably the most exclusive rooftop restaurant in all of Atlanta, boasting breathtaking panoramic views of the glittering city skyline through towering floor-to-ceiling glass walls. Vivian had aggressively rented out the entire top floor for the rehearsal dinner, sparing absolutely no expense to maintain the elaborate, desperate illusion of their immense wealth. A live string quartet played soft classical music in the dimly lit corner, while waiters in crisp white tuxedos glided flawlessly across the room, carrying heavy silver trays loaded with vintage champagne, fresh oysters, and imported caviar. The room was packed shoulder to shoulder with the elite tier of Atlanta society. Prominent board members, influential politicians, wealthy socialites, and rival real estate developers mingled under the modern crystal chandeliers. They were all completely oblivious to the massive financial crater forming beneath their feet, entirely unaware that this lavish event was being funded by the very last drops of Vivian's dangerously overextended personal credit lines. I stood quietly in the lavish lobby on the ground floor, waiting for the private express elevator to arrive. My heart beat with a steady, powerful rhythm. For 5 years, I had attended these exact same corporate dinners as the quiet, accommodating wife. I used to stand in the background, making sure Donovan did not embarrass himself in front of the investors, quietly fixing his mistakes and accepting his mother's constant passive-aggressive insults. Tonight, the dynamic was completely inverted. I was no longer the defensive player. I was the architect of their impending destruction, and I held the absolute power of ruin in my hands. Upstairs at the head table, the family sat on full display for the cameras. Lexi wore an ostentatious white silk dress that clung tightly to her frame, a garment deliberately chosen to highlight her pregnancy. She sat with perfect rigid posture, smiling brightly for the society photographers Vivian had hired, playing the role of the triumphant blushing bride to absolute perfection. But beneath the polished surface, the tension at the table was thick enough to cut with a knife. Donovan was sweating profusely, his face incredibly pale despite the warm, ambient lighting of the restaurant. He kept aggressively downing his champagne, his hands shaking slightly every single time he set the crystal flute back down on the white tablecloth. He knew the absolute truth. He knew that by Monday morning, the corporate accounts would begin bouncing their first major checks. And the very investors smiling at him right now would soon demand his head on a silver platter. Tasha sat on the opposite side of the table, glaring at Lexi with undisguised hatred. She was furious about the massive $2 million wedding budget, furious about the ridiculously rushed timeline, and completely disgusted by Lexi's sudden arrogant elevation to the very top of the family hierarchy. Next to Tasha sat Malik. He wore a sharp, custom designer suit and leaned back in his velvet chair with a relaxed, incredibly arrogant posture. Malik was drinking heavily, laughing loudly at the jokes made by the corporate board members, feeling completely untouchable. He believed his dirty secret was perfectly safe. He was entirely confident that he had successfully manipulated his way into a permanent, massive share of the grandfather's trust fund through Lexi's unborn twins. Vivian sat at the absolute center of it all, wrapped in emerald green velvet, her posture rigid and commanding. She was actively conducting the room like a seasoned military general, leading a desperate final campaign. Every single time a major investor approached the table, she forced Donovan to sit up straight, wipe the sweat from his forehead, and smile brightly. She was fighting a brutal psychological war to keep the illusion alive, projecting an aura of unstoppable financial dominance while her entire legacy secretly crumbled into dust. As the opulent dinner service finally concluded and the waiters efficiently cleared the expensive porcelain plates, Vivian stood up. She picked up a heavy silver spoon and tapped it gently against the side of her crystal champagne glass. The sharp, clear, ringing sound instantly commanded the attention of the entire room. The string quartet stopped playing mid-measure. The low hum of elite conversation faded away completely as all eyes turned to the formidable matriarch of the family. Vivian offered a warm, highly practiced smile to the crowd of wealthy guests. She began her speech by thanking everyone for attending on such incredibly short notice. She smoothly and confidently lied to the crowd, claiming that Donovan and Lexi were simply too deeply in love to wait another moment to start their beautiful lives together. The crowd chuckled politely, charmed by the fake romance. Then her tone shifted, becoming heavier, far more serious, and deeply pretentious. She spoke passionately about the fundamental importance of legacy. She proudly declared that their family had spent 3 generations building a massive real estate empire from the ground up. She called it an empire built on excellence, ruthless ambition, and an unwavering dedication to the strength of their name. She looked directly at Donovan, her voice echoing powerfully through the silent room. She stated that massive wealth is absolutely nothing without a pure bloodline to inherit it. She talked about the grandfather's massive trust fund, framing it not just as a financial safety net, but as a sacred holy reward reserved only for those who could provide legitimate biological heirs to carry the family torch into the next century. Then Vivian turned her cold, hard gaze toward the crowd. She elevated her chin and loudly declared that the family had recently been forced to purge itself of dead weight. She vaguely but pointedly referenced her son's past mistakes, clearly aiming her vicious words directly at my memory. She stated with absolute pride that they had finally removed the barren, unworthy elements that had been holding their great family back from reaching its true potential. She raised her glass high into the air, looking proudly at Lexi's stomach. She proposed a grand toast to the future, to the pure bloodline, and to the twin boys who would soon secure the absolute immortality of their glorious empire. The guests murmured in enthusiastic agreement, raising their expensive crystal glasses high into the air. But before a single person could take a sip of their champagne, the heavy brass doors of the private express elevator at the far end of the restaurant slid open with a loud mechanical chime. The sudden sound violently broke the solemnity of the toast. A few guests turned their heads out of mild curiosity, slightly annoyed by the interruption. Then more people turned. The soft whispers of confusion quickly morphed into a collective, stunned silence. The air in the room seemed to vanish entirely, sucked out by the sheer shock of the moment. I stepped out of the elevator and walked confidently onto the plush carpet. I wore a breathtaking, custom-tailored black Parisian gown. The heavy, luxurious silk draped elegantly over my shoulders and flowed smoothly down to the floor. The dress was sharply belted at the high waist, expertly designed to perfectly and entirely conceal my 5-month baby bump. I had paired the imposing gown with towering black heels and a single flawless diamond necklace that sparked fiercely under the modern chandeliers. My hair was pulled back into a sleek, severe style, exposing the sharp, determined angles of my face. I did not look anything like the quiet, accommodating accountant they were so used to walking all over. I looked like a force of absolute, unstoppable nature. The massive crowd of elite guests physically parted for me like the Red Sea. Whispers of pure shock rippled violently through the room. They all recognized me immediately. They all knew Vivian had just paid me millions of dollars to sign a quick divorce and quietly disappear. Seeing me here crashing the most exclusive high-stakes social event of the entire year sent a shockwave of pure electricity through the restaurant. I kept my eyes locked entirely on the head table as I walked the length of the room, my heels clicking sharply against the hardwood floor beneath the carpet. Lexi's jaw dropped completely open, her hand flying to her chest in genuine, unscripted shock. Tasha gasped loudly, her hand jerking so hard she spilled her dark red wine all over the pristine white tablecloth. Malik sat up incredibly straight, his arrogant, relaxed smirk instantly vanishing from his face as a look of deep confusion washed over him. Donovan looked like he had just seen a ghost. His eyes were wide with sheer, unadulterated terror, his face completely drained of any remaining color. He instinctively grabbed the heavy wooden edge of the table to steady himself, his knuckles turning pure white as his breathing grew shallow and rapid. Vivienne was the only one who reacted with immediate explosive anger. Her face flushed a deep, furious red, the veins popping visibly in her neck. She slammed her crystal champagne glass down onto the table so hard, the stem nearly snapped, the expensive liquid splashing wildly over the rim. She opened her mouth, her eyes burning with rage, preparing to scream at the security guards to physically throw me out of the building. But I reached the head table before she could even form the words. I did not yell. I did not cause a hysterical, emotional scene. I simply lifted my right arm and dropped a massive 3-inch thick legal binder directly onto the very center of their table. The heavy binder hit the solid wood with a loud, resounding crack that echoed like a gunshot through the completely silent restaurant. The gold-embossed logo of Apex Holdings gleamed brightly on the black leather cover, catching the light of the chandelier overhead. I looked directly into Vivian's furious, hateful eyes, offering a cold, perfectly measured, and deeply lethal smile. My voice was incredibly smooth, dripping with absolute confidence and entirely unbothered as it carried effortlessly across the quiet room. "Sorry I am late," I said, clearly ensuring every single wealthy investor and board member in the room could hear my exact words. "But the majority debt holder of your entire company really should not miss a family celebration." The heavy, suffocating silence shattered into a million jagged pieces. The elite guests, previously entranced by Vivian's pretentious speech about legacy and pure bloodlines, immediately erupted into chaotic whispers and frantic murmurs. The live string quartet in the corner had completely frozen their bows, hovering awkwardly over their instruments. Several prominent board members and wealthy investors stood up abruptly, their chairs scraping loudly against the expensive hardwood floor. They exchanged alarmed, panicked glances, the terrifying reality of their financial exposure suddenly crashing down upon them. Vivian's face transformed instantly from an elegant, composed mask of control into a twisted, ugly portrait of absolute fury. The veins in her neck bulged visibly against her emerald green velvet gown. She pointed a trembling finger directly at my face and screamed at the restaurant manager to call security immediately. She demanded that I be physically removed from the premises, loudly calling me a delusional, bitter ex-wife looking for a pathetic moment of revenge. She frantically assured the crowd that I was simply having a mental breakdown and that my claims were completely fabricated. But nobody moved to touch me. The heavy security guards standing by the elevator doors took one look at my confident posture, my expensive Parisian gown, and the massive legal binder sitting on the table, and they wisely decided to stay exactly where they were. I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice or react to Vivian's hysterical screaming. I simply stood there perfectly poised, resting my hand lightly on the black leather cover of the Apex Holdings portfolio. Donovan was practically hyperventilating. He stared at the gold-embossed logo of the Swiss shell company, then slowly looked up at my face. I watched the exact second his brain connected the dots. The anonymous international firm that had aggressively bought up their toxic loans, the ruthless entity that had suddenly frozen their primary credit lines. The invisible enemy that had completely paralyzed his entire commercial real estate empire overnight. It was me, the woman he had discarded like trash to please his mother and his mistress. I casually flipped open the heavy binder, completely ignoring Vivian's frantic threats. I spoke with a calm, undeniable authority that made the surrounding investors lean in closely to hear every single word. I looked directly at the panicked board members standing nearby and formally introduced myself as the primary controller of Apex Holdings. I explained with surgical precision that my firm had recently acquired a controlling 60% interest in the primary corporate debt of their entire real estate portfolio. I slowly and clearly listed the specific high-risk bridge loans, the frozen commercial credit lines, and the severe default covenants that Donovan had so recklessly breached without my daily forensic audits to protect him. Vivian lunged across the wide table, her hands grasping desperately for the documents, completely abandoning her high society dignity. I easily slid the binder out of her reach and closed it with a sharp snap. I looked her dead in the eye and told her the absolute truth. I told her I now legally held the primary mortgage to her precious corporate headquarters downtown. I told her I owned the debt securing her sprawling Buckhead estate. I explained that she was currently throwing a $2 million party using credit lines that were technically entirely under my jurisdiction. I was no longer the barren disappointment. I was her landlord, her bank, and her absolute master. The reaction from the investors was instantaneous and utterly brutal. The wealthy socialites and powerful politicians abandoned their expensive champagne and immediately swarmed the head table. They surrounded Vivian and Donovan, shouting furious questions about the frozen corporate accounts, the hidden debt acquisitions, and the blatant terrifying negligence of the executive team. They demanded to know how the family could possibly lose control of 60% of their debt without the board receiving a single warning notification. Lexi was crying real tears now. Her perfect, triumphant bridal facade was entirely shattered as she looked around the chaotic room. She realized in a matter of seconds that the massive generational fortune she thought she was marrying into was a complete illusion. The empire was broke, and she was shackled to a man who had just lost absolutely everything. Tasha was screaming at Donovan over the noise of the crowd, demanding to know how he could be so incredibly stupid to let an international firm buy them out. The perfect family unit was violently imploding exactly as I had calculated, tearing each other to pieces like starving wolves. I took a slow step back, removing myself from the center of the hurricane. I had delivered the first massive blow, and now I simply needed to let the poison work its way through their system. I smoothed the silk of my black gown, picked up my designer clutch, and walked casually toward the dimly lit mahogany bar at the far end of the restaurant. I ordered a glass of sparkling water with a twist of lemon, watching the glorious destruction unfold in the reflection of the massive mirror behind the bartender. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw Malik quietly slipping away from the screaming match at the head table. He was desperately trying to distance himself from the sinking ship, looking for a strong drink to steady his rapidly fraying nerves. He smoothed down his custom suit jacket and walked up to the bar, standing just a few feet away from me. He ordered a double whiskey neat, his hand visibly shaking as he reached into his pocket for his wallet. I turned to face him, my expression completely unreadable and cold. Malik tried to put on a brave face, adjusting his expensive tie and forcing a nervous, hollow chuckle. He looked at me and said I had pulled off one hell of a dramatic stunt, but he assured me that the corporate financial mess had absolutely nothing to do with him. He stated that he was just married to Tasha and stayed entirely out of Donovan's real estate business. He took a large, desperate gulp of his whiskey, clearly eager to escape back to his hotel room and avoid the fallout. I let him finish his drink before I made my move. I did not say a word at first. I simply reached into my clutch and pulled out my encrypted smartphone. I opened the secure folder and pulled up the high-resolution image Julian had sent me from Paris. It was the frozen frame from the security footage at the Vault nightclub, perfectly illuminated and incredibly damning. I placed the phone face down on the polished wood of the bar and slowly slid it over to him. I told him to pick it up and look closely at the screen. Malik rolled his eyes slightly, assuming I was just showing him a boring financial spreadsheet or a copy of the debt acquisition documents. He picked up the phone and flipped it over. I watched the exact second his heart stopped beating. The color violently drained from his face, leaving him looking like a sick, terrified ghost under the dim bar lights. He stared in absolute horror at the image of himself, heavily intoxicated, with his hands roaming aggressively all over Lexi's stomach, while she laughed victoriously. His mouth opened and closed repeatedly, like a fish suffocating on dry land, but absolutely no sound came out. His eyes darted wildly around the restaurant, suddenly terrified that Tasha or Vivian might be standing right behind him, looking over his shoulder. I stepped into his personal space, invading his comfort zone entirely. My voice dropped to a lethal, chilling whisper that cut straight through the ambient noise of the room. I told him I knew the absolute truth. I told him I knew exactly who fathered the precious twin boys Lexi was carrying. I knew about the secret bank accounts he used to pay her off the blackmail text messages she sent him, and the disgusting, vile betrayal happening right under Tasha's nose. Malik started to stammer uncontrollably. He tried to formulate a lie, desperately whispering that the photo was taken completely out of context, that he could explain everything. I cut him off instantly, my tone completely merciless. I reminded him of his precarious position in this family. I told him that his entire wealthy lifestyle, his expensive cars, his tailored suits, and his prestigious job title were entirely dependent on his marriage to Tasha. If Tasha divorced him, he would be thrown out into the street with absolutely nothing. And when the family empire officially declared bankruptcy tomorrow, Lexi would immediately dump him for a man who actually had real money. He had zero leverage and zero room to negotiate. I was holding the absolute destruction of his entire life in the palm of my hand. I leaned closer, ensuring every single word pierced directly through his arrogant armor. I told him to listen to me very carefully. Tomorrow was the big, expensive $2 million wedding. I demanded that he attend the ceremony, put on his expensive tuxedo, and play his role exactly as I instructed. I told him that he was my pawn now, if he deviated from my plan by a single inch. If he tried to run away, or if he tried to warn Lexi or Vivian about what I knew, I would send the video and the bank statements directly to Tasha's phone before the reception appetizers were even served. Malik was completely broken. The arrogant, untouchable director of investment acquisitions was instantly reduced to a trembling, sweating mess of a man. He gripped the edge of the mahogany bar to keep his knees from buckling. He nodded frantically, his eyes wide with genuine, unadulterated fear. He whispered that he understood, begging me not to ruin him, promising he would do absolutely whatever I wanted. I smiled coldly, reaching out and taking my phone back from his shaking hands. I dropped the device securely back into my clutch. I picked up my glass of sparkling water, took a slow, refreshing sip, and walked away from the bar without looking back once. The psychological warfare was complete. I had successfully divided their ranks, paralyzed their leadership, and captured my crucial inside man. The rehearsal dinner was in absolute ruins, but the real show, the grand finale of their complete destruction, was scheduled for tomorrow morning at the altar. The morning of the $2 million wedding finally arrived, dawning with a bright, mocking sunshine that stood in sharp contrast to the absolute darkness currently swallowing Vivian's empire. The sprawling Buckhead estate was completely transformed into a chaotic hive of luxury preparation. Hundreds of workers buzzed across the massive manicured lawns. Elite florists were busy constructing towering arches of white roses, while exclusive caterers rushed to set up the lavish champagne fountains and caviar stations for the upcoming reception. The sheer scale of the extravagant spending was entirely sickening, especially knowing that every single penny paying for these beautiful flowers was drawn from the very last drops of Vivian's desperately overextended personal credit lines. I did not wait for an official invitation to enter the property. I simply drove my rented black SUV through the open iron gates, bypassing the distracted security guards who were too busy directing catering trucks to notice my arrival. I stepped out of the vehicle wearing a razor-sharp, tailored white designer suit. I chose white deliberately, a subtle visual mockery of the traditional bridal colors Lexi was currently squeezing herself into upstairs. I walked with absolute purpose through the grand mahogany double doors of the mansion and headed straight toward Vivian's private executive library. I knew exactly where she would be hiding. When I opened the heavy oak doors of the library, the suffocating tension in the room hit me instantly. Vivian was standing behind her massive antique desk, gripping the edge of the wood so tightly her knuckles were completely white. She was not wearing her elegant mother-of-the-groom dress yet. She was still wearing a dark, rigid business suit, her hair pulled back tightly, her face drawn and haggard from a completely sleepless night. Flanking her on either side were two incredibly expensive, aggressive corporate lawyers. They wore custom Italian suits and carried thick leather briefcases brought in specifically to intimidate me into a quick submission. Vivienne did not offer a greeting. She immediately launched her attack, her voice dripping with the familiar toxic arrogance I had endured for 5 years. She told me to shut the door and sit down. She confidently declared that my pathetic little stunt at the rehearsal dinner was officially over, and that I had exactly 5 minutes to sign a full retraction before she absolutely destroyed my life. I closed the door quietly, but I did not sit down. I stood in the center of the plush Persian rug, holding my sleek black briefcase, projecting an aura of total, unshakable control. The senior attorney, a tall man with silver hair and a deeply condescending sneer, stepped forward to take the lead. He adjusted his expensive silk tie and began rattling off a rapid-fire list of severe legal threats. He accused me of tortious interference, corporate espionage, and malicious defamation. He claimed that my Swiss shell company, Apex Holdings, had acquired the corporate debt through highly illegal and fraudulent means. He slapped a thick stack of legal documents onto the desk, demanding that I sign an immediate transfer of all debt assets back to the family firm, along with a strict non-disclosure agreement. If I refused, he promised to tie me up in federal litigation for the next decade, freeze my personal bank accounts, and sue me for every single penny I possessed until I was completely bankrupt and begging on the streets. Vivienne crossed her arms, a smug, victorious smile finally returning to her exhausted face. She firmly believed that the mere presence of her high-powered legal team would instantly reduce me to the quiet, obedient girl from the south side of Atlanta who used to tremble at her every command. I let the senior attorney finish his entire aggressive speech. I did not interrupt him once. When the room finally fell silent, I offered a slow, incredibly cold smile. I reached down, popped the golden clasps of my briefcase, and pulled out a single, heavily indexed blue folder. I did not address Vivian at all. I walked straight up to the desk and handed the folder directly to the senior attorney. I told him I highly suggested he read the first 3 pages before he threw around terms like federal litigation and corporate espionage. I reminded him that I was a certified forensic accountant who had personally audited this specific commercial real estate firm for 5 consecutive years. I knew where every single dollar was buried, and more importantly, I knew exactly how his client had desperately tried to hide her tracks. The lawyer scoffed dismissively, but he opened the folder. His junior partner leaned in closely to read over his shoulder. I watched their eyes scan the top sheet, a meticulously detailed balance ledger I had reconstructed from the hidden corporate files. I began to narrate the exact timeline of the crime, my voice echoing with surgical, undeniable precision. I explained that exactly 3 weeks ago, Vivian handed me a cashier's check for $9 million to secure a rapid divorce. I told the lawyers that Vivian had proudly claimed the money came from her own massive personal wealth. However, I pointed to the second page in the folder. It was a direct copy of the internal wire transfer authorization forms from the company's restricted emergency reserve account. I watched the senior attorney's eyes widen as he recognized the highly sensitive corporate banking codes. I continued my brutal explanation, stating that Vivian had bypassed the mandatory board of directors approval process to initiate that massive transfer. To completely mask the illegal withdrawal, she had forged the digital signatures of two key executive board members. She then laundered the $9 million through 3 different subsidiary shell accounts before finally converting it into the untraceable cashier's check. She slid across the dining room table. The room grew so incredibly quiet I could hear the expensive grandfather clock ticking in the corner. I leaned forward, resting both my hands flat on the polished wood of the desk, completely dominating the physical space. I looked directly at the 2 lawyers and delivered the killing blow. I told them that their client did not just execute a messy divorce settlement, she committed textbook, massive corporate embezzlement. She stole $9 million directly from her own private investors to cover up her son's scandalous affair. And because she used electronic wire transfers to move the stolen funds across state lines, it was officially a federal crime carrying a mandatory minimum sentence of 20 years in a federal penitentiary. The reaction from the legal team was an absolute masterpiece of professional self-preservation. The senior attorney physically dropped the blue folder onto the desk as if it were literally on fire. The blood completely drained from his face. In the corporate legal world, attorneys are fiercely protective of their own licenses and reputations. The absolute last thing they ever want is to be caught actively defending a client who has handed an opposing party highly documented, undeniable proof of massive federal fraud. The junior attorney immediately took a massive step backward, physically distancing himself from Vivian. The senior lawyer aggressively cleared his throat, his previous arrogance entirely evaporated. He looked at Vivian with pure, unfiltered disgust and stated that his firm was completely unaware of these specific financial transactions. He officially declared that they could no longer represent her in any capacity regarding this matter, citing a massive conflict of ethical interest. Without waiting for her response, both lawyers swiftly packed their expensive briefcases, turned on their heels, and practically ran out of the library, slamming the heavy oak doors shut behind them. Vivian was left completely alone. Her powerful legal shield had shattered into a million pieces in less than 3 minutes. She stared blindly at the blue folder sitting on her desk, her breathing growing incredibly shallow and rapid. The terrifying reality of her situation finally crashed down upon her, crushing the very last remnants of her massive ego. She looked up at me, her eyes filled with a raw, undeniable terror I had never seen before. She tried to speak, but her voice was nothing more than a pathetic, broken whisper. She begged me to keep the documents private, promising that we could negotiate a quiet settlement, offering to give me whatever I wanted. I stood up straight, adjusting the lapels of my white suit, feeling the absolute power of the moment surge through my veins. I did not want her pathetic negotiations. I wanted total surrender. I reached into my briefcase one final time and pulled out the official default notices from Apex Holdings. I dropped the heavy legal papers right on top of her forged wire transfers. I looked down at her, my voice completely devoid of any mercy or hesitation. I told her the time for secret settlements expired the exact moment she told me to take her dirty money and vanish. I issued my final non-negotiable ultimatum. I demanded that she wire the outstanding $15 million debt balance directly to my Swiss accounts in exactly 2 hours. If the funds were not completely cleared by the time the priest began the wedding ceremony, I would immediately file the default notices with the federal bankruptcy courts. I would legally seize the corporate headquarters downtown, I would foreclose on this sprawling mansion, and I would hand the embezzlement files directly to the FBI. Vivian slumped back into her leather chair, completely paralyzed. We both knew the absolute truth. She had zero liquidity. The frozen credit lines meant she could not borrow another dime, and she had literally spent her last available dollar on the ridiculous floral arrangements sitting outside the window. She was entirely trapped in a cage of her own making, completely bankrupt, and staring down the barrel of a federal prison sentence. I picked up my briefcase and turned toward the door. I paused with my hand on the brass doorknob, glancing over my shoulder at the completely broken matriarch. I told her to go put on her expensive dress and smile for the cameras. I told her the guests were waiting, and I absolutely could not wait to take my seat in the front row. I stepped out of the dark, suffocating library and back into the bright, chaotic hallways of the mansion. The transition was incredibly jarring. While Vivian was having a total psychological collapse behind those heavy oak doors, staring at the absolute proof of her federal crimes, the rest of the estate was a buzzing hive of absolute luxury. I walked down the grand marble corridor toward the back gardens where the ceremony was scheduled to take place. The sheer scale of the waste was entirely sickening. Waiters in crisp white uniforms rushed past me carrying silver trays of imported champagne flutes, completely unaware that their paychecks were going to bounce by Monday morning. Through the massive front windows, I could see the flashes of cameras. Vivian had intentionally leaked the exact time and location to the local paparazzi and society bloggers. She wanted to guarantee a heavy media presence to desperately project her fake image of endless wealth to the Atlanta business world. Dozens of photographers were crammed against the wrought iron gates, fighting for the best angle of the arriving billionaires, local politicians, and real estate moguls. They had absolutely no idea they were about to photograph the most expensive, highly publicized funeral in corporate history. The ceremony was taking place on the sprawling back lawn, which had been completely transformed into a breathtaking floral wonderland. Thousands of imported white orchids and cascading roses hung from a massive custom-built canopy, filling the warm afternoon air with a heavy, intoxicating perfume. A string orchestra played a soft classical melody on a raised platform, surrounded by tall crystal pillars and perfectly manicured hedges. I bypassed the eager ushers and walked straight down the center aisle. My white designer suit cut a sharp, undeniable contrast against the dark mahogany chairs and the colorful designer gowns of the attending socialites. I ignored the confused, scandalized whispers of the wealthy guests who recognized me as the recently discarded wife. I took my seat in the very front row. I claimed the prime spot traditionally reserved for the immediate family, sitting directly across from the altar, ensuring I had a perfect, unobstructed view of the impending destruction. Tasha was already seated a few chairs away from me. She was wearing a hideous ruffled pink bridesmaid dress that Lexi had clearly chosen out of pure spite to humiliate her. Tasha glared at me with absolute venom, but she did not dare say a single word. She was too terrified of the massive financial ruin I had revealed at the rehearsal dinner. Sitting directly next to Tasha was Malik. He looked absolutely dreadful. His custom-tailored tuxedo hung awkwardly on his frame, and his skin had a terrible sickly gray undertone. He kept pulling nervously at his tight collar, his eyes darting frantically around the garden like a trapped animal. Every single time he looked in my direction, I offered him a slow, incredibly cold smile. I did not have to say anything to him. The invisible weight of the security footage I held securely on my encrypted phone was pressing down heavily on his chest, slowly crushing his lungs and suffocating his arrogance. The orchestra music shifted to a slightly deeper, more formal tone, signaling the beginning of the procession. Donovan walked out from the side of the floral canopy to take his place at the altar. He looked exactly like a man walking directly to his own execution. He was sweating profusely through his expensive black tuxedo. His hair, usually styled perfectly, was slightly disheveled, and his hands trembled visibly as he clasped them tightly in front of him. He stared blankly ahead, entirely trapped in his own personal nightmare. He knew exactly what time it was. He knew my 2-hour deadline was rapidly approaching, and he knew his mother had absolutely zero liquid cash to wire to my Swiss accounts. Every single tick of his luxury wristwatch was another massive step closer to the total foreclosure of his family empire and his own permanent public disgrace. When Donovan finally forced himself to look down at the front row, his eyes locked directly onto mine. I sat perfectly poised, my legs crossed, resting my hands neatly in my lap. I did not glare at him. I did not show an ounce of anger. I simply looked at him with the calm, detached observation of a forensic auditor reviewing a completely bankrupt ledger. Donovan swallowed hard, his Adam Adams apple bobbing nervously. He looked physically sick to his stomach. The confident, arrogant executive who had told me he desperately needed a legacy just 3 weeks ago was completely gone. In his place stood a broken, pathetic fraud who had sold his entire life and his massive family legacy for a lie. A few moments later, Vivian made her grand entrance. She walked down the aisle on the arm of a senior corporate board member wearing a stunning silver gown heavily embroidered with expensive crystals. To the untrained eye, she looked like the proud, victorious matriarch of an unstoppable Southern dynasty. She smiled brightly at the flashing cameras, nodding graciously to the wealthy investors she had specifically invited to witness her final triumph. But looking closely, I could see the absolute terror hiding right behind her heavily made-up eyes. I could see the slight tremor in her hands and the rigid, highly unnatural stiffness of her posture. She was using every single ounce of her willpower to hold her shattered reality together for just one more hour. She carefully avoided looking at me as she took her seat on the opposite side of the aisle, staring straight ahead like a beautifully dressed, incredibly fragile statue that was about to shatter into a million pieces. Suddenly, the entire orchestra swelled, launching into the grand traditional bridal chorus. The heavy floral gates at the back of the lawn swung open, and Lexi began her long, dramatic walk down the aisle. She looked incredibly triumphant. Her custom Milanese gown was a massive explosion of heavy white silk and expensive imported lace, featuring a plunging neckline and a sweeping train that required two frantic assistants to manage. The dress was meticulously tailored to highlight her pregnant stomach, serving as a walking, breathing advertisement for the fake bloodline she was bringing into the family. Her face was flushed with pure arrogance and complete victory. She smiled radiantly at the guests, convinced she had just won the ultimate lottery. She thought she was marrying into a massive, untouchable fortune. She fully believed she had successfully outsmarted me, successfully blackmailed Malik, and successfully secured her permanent place at the very top of Atlanta high society. As Lexi reached the front of the aisle, she paused to look at Donovan. She clearly expected to see tears of joy, overwhelming love, and profound gratitude in his eyes. Instead, she was met with a pale, sweating man who looked like he was about to pass out from sheer panic. Lexi's victorious smile faltered for just a fraction of a second, a quick flash of genuine confusion crossing her perfectly contoured face. But she rapidly recovered, turning her attention to the priest and taking Donovan's cold, trembling hands in hers. The priest, an older gentleman with a deep, resonant voice, stepped up to the wooden podium. He smiled warmly at the couple and then out at the massive crowd of elite guests. The garden fell completely silent save for the soft rustling of the warm wind through the massive floral arches and the distant, constant clicking of the paparazzi cameras outside the estate walls. The priest began the traditional ceremony with grand, sweeping words about the sanctity of marriage, the deep bonds of eternal love, and the incredible importance of building a strong, honest foundation for the future generation. Every single word he spoke was dripping with a profound, bitter irony that only a few of us sitting in the front row could truly understand. He talked passionately about honesty while the bride was secretly carrying another man's children. He talked about strength and provision while the groom was literally bankrupt and days away from total financial ruin. He talked about family values while the mother of the groom was facing a mandatory federal prison sentence for massive corporate fraud. It was a spectacular, $2 million theater of absolute lies, and I was holding the match that was going to burn it all straight to the ground. I sat perfectly still, listening to the priest's echoing voice, quietly counting the passing seconds in my head. I looked over at Malik. The psychological pressure was completely breaking him apart from the inside out. His breathing had become incredibly shallow and rapid. He was sweating right through his crisp white shirt, his eyes darting frantically between me. His completely clueless wife Tasha sitting beside him, and Lexi standing triumphantly at the altar. He knew the absolute destruction that was coming. He knew I had the VIP room video. He knew I had the secret bank records, and he knew my ultimatum from the rehearsal dinner was absolute. I had told him to play exactly by my rules, or I would completely expose his disgusting, vile affair before the reception appetizers were even served. The priest shifted his tone, his voice growing incredibly solemn and serious as he reached the most critical, highly anticipated part of the entire traditional service. He looked directly out at the massive crowd of wealthy guests, his words carrying clearly over the silent, completely captivated garden. "Dearly beloved," the priest announced, his voice echoing off the crystal pillars. "We are gathered here today to join this man and this woman in holy matrimony. If any person here can show just cause why they may not lawfully be joined together, speak now or forever hold your peace." The priest paused, a traditional polite silence settling over the large crowd. It was the part of the ceremony where absolutely nothing is ever supposed to happen. The wealthy guests smiled softly, waiting for the priest to smoothly continue with the exchanging of the vows. Lexi beamed, her chin lifted high in absolute arrogance, ready to claim her ultimate prize. Donovan closed his eyes, desperately praying for the nightmare to just end so he could run inside and try to beg me for mercy one last time. I did not move a single muscle. I simply turned my head slightly, locking my eyes directly onto Malik. I stared at him with an expression of pure icy command. It was time. The silence stretched for 1 second, 2 seconds, 3 seconds, and then the loud, abrasive sound of a heavy wooden chair scraping violently against the stone patio entirely shattered the quiet garden. Everyone gasped loudly and rapidly turned their heads. Tasha jumped in her seat, her eyes wide with total shock. Vivian whipped her head around her perfectly manicured facade, finally permanently cracking. Lexi dropped Donovan's hands, a look of pure panic washing over her face. Malik was on his feet. He had stood up so abruptly that his wooden chair had nearly toppled over backward. He was hyperventilating, his chest heaving violently up and down in his tight tuxedo jacket. His hands were clenched into tight fists at his sides, and his face was a mask of absolute, unadulterated terror. He looked completely broken, completely defeated, and entirely unable to hold the massive weight of the lie for a single second longer. The entire garden stared at him in stunning, breathless disbelief, waiting in absolute shock for the massive explosion that was about to blow their perfect, wealthy empire into a million tiny, irreparable pieces. Malik's mouth opened, but his vocal cords completely failed him. He stood frozen, a statue of absolute guilt, under the bright afternoon sun. Donovan glared at him, deeply confused by the sudden outburst, while Tasha yanked violently on Malik's tuxedo jacket, aggressively hissing at him to sit back down and stop embarrassing her. The priest looked utterly bewildered, clutching his leather-bound Bible to his chest, unsure if he should continue speaking or call for medical assistance. Before Malik could finally force the devastating confession past his lips, a massive commotion erupted at the very back of the estate gardens. The heavy wrought iron gates, which had been securely closed to keep the aggressive paparazzi at bay, were suddenly pushed open with a loud metallic screech. A man wearing a bright yellow medical courier uniform marched aggressively onto the pristine lawn. He was completely out of place among the sea of designer gowns, pastel silk suits, and expensive floral arrangements. He carried a highly secure bright red tamper-proof envelope in his right hand. Two of Vivian's hired security guards rushed forward immediately to intercept him, grabbing his shoulders to physically throw him out. But the courier expertly dodged their grasp, shouting loudly that he had an emergency, legally mandated medical delivery that required an immediate physical signature from the groom. He cited strict federal healthcare privacy laws at the top of his lungs, causing the security guards to hesitate just long enough for him to break through their defensive line. The live string orchestra completely abandoned their instruments, creating a jarring, discordant screech of horsehair against cello strings. The wealthy guests craned their necks, murmuring in shocked confusion as the courier practically sprinted down the white-carpeted aisle. I remained perfectly still in my front row seat, watching the magnificent chaos unfold exactly as I had orchestrated. I had paid an absolute premium to an elite private medical facility to expedite those specific NIPT DNA results, and I had commanded them to deliver the documents at this precise, spectacular moment. The courier reached the raised wooden altar, breathing heavily, completely ignoring the sheer outrage radiating from Vivian in the front row. He held out an electronic clipboard directly to Donovan, loudly demanding a signature for a priority genetic testing dossier. Donovan was visibly trembling. His brain, already severely compromised by the crushing weight of his impending corporate bankruptcy, simply could not process this bizarre interruption. He looked helplessly at Lexi, desperately searching for an explanation, but her victorious bridal mask had entirely melted away. Lexi was staring at the bright red envelope with a look of pure, unadulterated horror. She knew exactly what kind of medical test came in those specific secure packages. Donovan blindly took the stylus and scrawled his name on the digital screen. The courier immediately handed him the heavy envelope, turned around, and marched rapidly back down the aisle, leaving a profound, suffocating silence in his wake. Donovan stood at the altar holding the bright red envelope as if it were an active explosive device. Vivian finally found her voice screeching frantically from her seat, demanding that Donovan hand the package to a security guard and proceed with the wedding immediately. She desperately tried to command the priest to continue reading the vows, but Donovan did not listen to his mother. A sudden terrifying wave of suspicion washed over his pale, sweating face. He looked at Lexi's terrified, trembling form, noticing how she instinctively took a step backward away from him. Then he looked down at the envelope. His shaking fingers tore violently at the tamper-proof seal. He pulled out a thick stack of official laboratory documents printed on heavy watermarked medical paper. The silence in the garden was so absolute that the crisp rustle of the turning pages sounded incredibly loud, echoing sharply against the crystal pillars. Donovan scanned the first page, his eyes darting frantically across the complex medical jargon until he reached the final bolded conclusion at the very bottom. I watched the exact second his fragile, arrogant world completely shattered. He gasped loudly, taking a staggering step backward, nearly tripping over the edge of the wooden platform. Lexi reached out to grab his arm desperately, whispering his name, begging him to listen to her, but he violently shoved her hand away. His face twisted into a mask of pure agony and furious betrayal. He looked directly at Lexi, his voice cracking loudly as he read the devastating sentence to the entire crowd. 0% probability of paternity. The high society audience gasped in unison. A massive wave of shocked, scandalized whispers instantly rolled through the perfectly manicured garden. Wealthy investors dropped their jaws, and prominent politicians covered their mouths in disbelief. Lexi burst into frantic, hysterical tears. She aggressively shook her head, screaming that the laboratory had made a massive mistake, claiming the test was completely fake, and that I had somehow engineered the documents to ruin her life. But Donovan was not finished reading. His eyes moved down to the secondary genetic analysis paragraph on the second page. His breath hitched violently in his throat. He read aloud, his voice shaking with furious intensity, that while he was absolutely excluded as the biological father, the advanced genetic markers proved with 99% certainty that the actual father of the twins was a first-degree male relative. Donovan slowly lowered the medical papers. The warm summer air in the garden instantly turned completely to ice. The devastating mathematical reality of his family tree clicked into place. Donovan had no brothers. His father was an only child who had passed away years ago. There was only one single genetically related male sitting in the immediate family section. Donovan slowly turned his head, his devastated, bloodshot eyes locking directly onto Malik. Malik could not handle the intense burning weight of the sudden realization crashing down on the entire crowd. The lethal combination of my psychological blackmail at the rehearsal dinner and the undeniable scientific proof lying right on the altar completely broke his remaining resolve. Malik's knees gave out instantly. He collapsed heavily onto the stone patio, sobbing uncontrollably into his hands, ruining his expensive custom tuxedo. He did not even try to deny it. He loudly and pathetically confessed to absolutely everything, his voice echoing tragically across the beautiful floral arches. He screamed that he was so incredibly sorry. He admitted that he and Lexi had been sleeping together for months behind everyone's backs, meeting in cheap hotels and VIP nightclub rooms. He confessed that Lexi had actively blackmailed him with explicit photographs, forcing him to help her convince Donovan that the twins belonged to the main family line so she could secure the massive grandfather's trust fund for herself. He blubbered violently, begging Tasha for forgiveness, begging Vivian not to destroy his career. completely throwing the pregnant bride under the proverbial bus to save his own miserable skin. Tasha stood entirely paralyzed for exactly 3 seconds. She stared down at her sobbing husband on the ground, processing the massive, humiliating betrayal of her entire marriage. Then she slowly turned her head to look up at Lexi. Lexi was backing away from the altar, her heavy silk train tangling awkwardly around her ankles, looking exactly like a trapped animal desperately searching for an exit. The sheer explosive rage that suddenly radiated from Tasha was terrifying to witness. Tasha let out a blood-curdling primal scream that completely shattered the sophisticated elite atmosphere of the estate. She did not politely ask for a divorce, and she did not cry gracefully into her hands. Tasha snapped. She lunged forward, sprinting directly onto the raised altar, tackling Lexi with the absolute force of a speeding truck. The two women crashed violently to the wooden floor in a massive explosion of white bridal silk and pink bridesmaid tulle. Tasha grabbed handfuls of Lexi's expensive custom imported designer veil and tore it brutally from her scalp, ripping the heavy hairpins right out of her updo. Lexi shrieked in genuine pain, kicking wildly in her expensive heels, her perfectly manicured nails clawing frantically at Tasha's face. Tasha delivered a vicious slap across Lexi's cheek, screaming that she was a disgusting, manipulative gold digger who had ruined her entire life. The $2 million wedding instantly devolving into a chaotic, incredibly violent street brawl. The elegant, towering floral arrangements were completely smashed as the two women rolled aggressively across the altar. Expensive white orchids and imported roses flew through the air like shredded confetti. Donovan just stood there entirely catatonic, clutching the DNA results tightly to his chest, staring blankly at the violent physical destruction of his fake legacy. The wealthy guests, the elite investors, and the influential politicians leaped out of their mahogany chairs shouting in pure panic. Several people frantically pulled out their smartphones, rapidly recording the humiliating physical spectacle. Outside the iron gates, the paparazzi went completely insane. Their high-powered camera flashes strobed like a violent lightning storm, easily capturing every single second of the spectacular, highly public implosion of Atlanta's most prestigious family. Vivian stood frozen in the front row, clutching her chest, her face completely devoid of all color. She looked like she was about to suffer a massive heart attack. Her precious pure bloodline was a massive, disgusting lie, playing out violently in front of the exact high society people she needed to impress the most to save her failing company. Her entire life's work, her massive ego, and her pristine reputation were completely annihilated in a matter of seconds. And through all the screaming, the physical fighting, and the flashing cameras, I simply remained seated in my front row chair. I sat perfectly calm, entirely untouched by the flying debris and the emotional carnage, watching my beautiful, flawless checkmate unfold with absolute triumphant satisfaction. The violent struggle on the wooden altar lasted for 2 agonizing minutes before Vivian's hired security guards finally managed to pry Tasha off the screaming bride. Tasha was breathing heavily, her face flushed with absolute rage, her hands tightly clutching shredded pieces of expensive Milanese lace. Lexi was a complete disaster. Her pristine white silk gown was ripped along the side seam. Her elaborate hairstyle was entirely ruined, and a thin scratch ran down her cheek where Tasha's manicured nails had made contact. Lexi scrambled backward across the wooden floorboards, sobbing hysterically, desperately trying to cover her face, as the relentless flashing of the paparazzi cameras outside the gates illuminated her total humiliation. The sheer physical violence of the moment seemed to finally snap Donovan out of his catatonic trance. He dropped the crumpled DNA results onto the destroyed floral arrangements scattered across the floor. His face turned a deep, dangerous shade of purple as his shock violently morphed into explosive, unhinged rage. He lunged toward Lexi, his fists clenched tight at his sides. The security guards had to quickly step between them to prevent him from physically attacking the pregnant woman. Donovan pointed a shaking finger directly at the estate gates and screamed at the top of his lungs. His voice cracked with sheer fury as he demanded that she get out of his house immediately. He called her a parasite, a disgusting liar, and a cheap fraud. He roared at her to take her bastard twins and crawl back to the gutter she came from, swearing that if he ever saw her face on his property again, he would have her arrested for criminal extortion. Lexi did not attempt to argue or defend herself. She knew the absolute truth was out, and her golden ticket was completely gone. She pulled herself up from the floor, grabbed the torn layers of her massive silk skirt, and ran blindly down the side aisle. She sprinted across the manicured lawn, weeping loudly, fleeing directly into the chaotic swarm of screaming photographers waiting eagerly outside the iron gates. Malik used the distraction to quietly scramble away from the altar, keeping his head down like a beaten dog disappearing into the maze of terrified guests. Donovan stood alone on the ruined altar chest, heaving, completely surrounded by smashed white orchids and the total wreckage of his personal life. The wealthy guests were entirely silent now, watching the devastated groom with a mixture of profound pity and absolute disgust. But Donovan's furious adrenaline spike did not last long. The violent reality of his financial situation rapidly crashed down on his shoulders. He looked wildly at his expensive wristwatch. He had less than 30 minutes left before the deadline I had issued in the library expired. Without the wedding and without the verified blood heirs, the grandfather's massive trust fund remained completely and securely locked. He had absolutely no money to pay off the Apex Holdings default. Donovan's panicked eyes scanned the crowd until they locked directly onto me. I was still sitting perfectly upright in the front row, completely untouched by the chaos. All of his anger instantly evaporated, replaced by a desperate, pathetic need for survival. He stumbled down the wooden steps of the altar, practically tripping over his own feet as he rushed toward my chair. He fell to his knees right on the grass in front of me, uncaring that the elite investors and corporate board members were watching his ultimate degradation. He reached out with trembling, sweaty hands desperately trying to grab the fabric of my white designer suit. I sharply pulled my legs back, refusing to let him touch me. Donovan looked up at me with tears streaming down his face, begging for mercy. He claimed that we were both innocent victims of Lexi's massive deception. He frantically spun a pathetic narrative claiming that he had been completely manipulated and blinded by a professional con artist. He pointed a trembling finger toward the front row where Vivian sat frozen, loudly blaming his own mother for aggressively pushing the divorce and forcing him to abandon our marriage to secure the legacy. He sobbed, begging me to remember the 5 years we spent together. He pleaded with me to call my Swiss attorneys and stop the Apex Holdings foreclosure. He swore that if I gave him the company back, he would spend the rest of his life making it up to me, promising to completely banish Vivian and Malik from the business forever. I looked down at the weeping, pathetic man kneeling in the grass. He was willing to throw his mother, his best friend, and his mistress entirely to the wolves just to save his own skin. He had absolutely no loyalty, no backbone, and no genuine remorse. He was only sorry because he had been caught and financially cornered. I did not answer him. I simply stood up. I smoothed the crisp fabric of my white blazer and stepped carefully around his kneeling, trembling form. I walked slowly and deliberately up the wooden steps of the destroyed altar. I stepped over the torn pieces of Lexi's veil and positioned myself exactly where the bride was supposed to stand. I turned around to face the massive crowd of Atlanta's elite society. The garden was so quiet, I could hear the faint buzzing of insects in the hedges. The wealthy socialites, the aggressive board members, and the panicked investors all stared up at me, waiting with bated breath. I looked directly at the senior members of the corporate board who were sitting in the second row. I knew every single one of them by name from my years of conducting their internal audits. I spoke with a loud, incredibly clear voice that carried effortlessly across the silent garden, entirely commanding the space. I informed the board members that the lavish spectacle they had just witnessed was nothing more than a desperate, pathetic smokescreen. I explained that the family firm was completely insolvent, their credit lines were entirely frozen, and their primary commercial loans were actively in default. The investors gasped, exchanging panicked looks. The immediate threat to their massive portfolios instantly overriding the scandalous family drama. I raised my hand to command their attention back to me. I explained that 3 weeks ago, Vivian had handed me a cashier's check for $9 million to silently disappear and allow this fraudulent wedding to take place. I looked directly at the board members and revealed the exact origin of those funds. I told them that their trusted matriarch had illegally bypassed their authority, forged executive signatures, and embezzled that $9 million directly from their restricted corporate emergency reserves. A loud, furious uproar instantly ignited among the corporate executives. They turned fiercely toward Vivienne, shouting angry threats of federal prosecution and immediate arrest. But my voice sliced sharply through their anger, demanding absolute silence for my final revelation. I reached inside the sleek interior pocket of my white blazer and pulled out a thick, tightly folded legal envelope. I looked down at Donovan, who was still kneeling helplessly on the grass, staring up at me with wide, terrified eyes. I proudly announced to the entire crowd that I did not take their stolen money and run away. I explained that I used my elite forensic accounting network to create Apex Holdings. I took the exact same $9 million that Vivienne had illegally embezzled from her own investors, and I used it to aggressively buy up 60% of their high-risk corporate debt at a massive discount. I stated clearly and factually that I was the anonymous firm freezing their accounts. I was the ruthless entity holding their commercial mortgages. And because my 2-hour deadline had officially expired without payment, I was now the absolute legal owner of their entire real estate empire. I stepped down from the wooden altar, holding the heavy legal envelope in my right hand. I walked directly over to Donovan. He was shaking so violently his teeth were literally chattering. I looked at him with an expression of pure, unadulterated ice. I did not feel an ounce of pity for the man who had let his family emotionally torture me for 5 years. I slapped the thick stack of official foreclosure documents and federal default notices firmly against his chest, forcing him to take them. "You sold your entire family legacy to buy yourself a pair of horns, Donovan," I said, my voice ringing with absolute devastating finality. "The company is mine." "Yes, Donovan let out a broken, agonizing wail. He collapsed entirely onto the ground, curling into a tight fetal position on the manicured grass, clutching the foreclosure documents to his chest as he wept uncontrollably. His entire life, his unearned wealth, his prestigious executive title, and his fake masculine pride were completely and permanently destroyed. I turned my attention to the front row. Vivienne had witnessed the entire execution. She had heard the furious board members actively discussing calling the FBI to report her massive embezzlement. She had watched the ultimate undeniable proof of her financial destruction handed directly to her broken son. The absolute reality of her situation finally breached the massive walls of her incredible arrogance. She realized she had lost absolutely everything. Her precious company was entirely gone. Her pure bloodline was a massive, humiliating joke broadcasted to the entire city. Her massive wealth was completely seized, and a dark, cold federal prison cell was waiting for her in the very near future. Vivienne's hands flew up to grip the fabric of her expensive silver gown. Her eyes rolled back into her head as a sudden sharp pain seized her chest. She gasped violently for air, her perfectly styled hair falling wildly around her face. She let out a weak, pathetic choking sound before she physically gave out. The formidable, terrifying matriarch of the Atlanta elite completely collapsed backward into the heavy mahogany pew, clutching her chest tightly as her body went entirely limp, finally breaking under the immense crushing weight of her own spectacular ruin. The gasps of the wealthy guests echoed around the garden as Vivienne slumped against the hard wood of the pew. A few people rushed forward to fan her face, but the fierce, proud matriarch aggressively swatted their hands away. She was physically broken, gasping for air, but her massive ego simply refused to die quietly. She gripped the edge of the mahogany bench with trembling, claw-like fingers, and forced herself to sit upright. Her eyes filled with an unimaginable toxic hatred locked onto me one final time. She was desperate to claim a single microscopic victory from the ashes of her completely incinerated life. She pointed a shaking finger at my face, her chest heaving as she spat her final venomous curse. "You can take the buildings," she hissed, her voice a ragged, breathless wheeze that carried across the silent lawn. "You can take the bank accounts and the mansions, but you will never ever touch the $150 million trust fund. That money is completely untouchable. It belongs strictly to the pure bloodline, and you are absolutely nothing but a barren outsider." I did not flinch at her desperate screaming. Instead, I offered her a devastatingly calm, radiant smile. The kind of smile that comes from knowing you hold the ultimate undeniable winning hand. I stood completely still in the center of the ruined altar. Slowly and deliberately, I reached up and unbuttoned the center clasp of my oversized white designer blazer. I pulled the heavy silk fabric back, letting it fall open to reveal the tailored form-fitting dress underneath. The undeniable, perfectly rounded curve of my 5-month pregnant belly was instantly visible to the entire crowd. Another massive collective gasp ripped through the high society audience. The wealthy investors who had just spent the last 10 minutes watching a violent brawl and a corporate foreclosure were now staring in absolute shock at my stomach. I reached into my black designer clutch and pulled out a glossy black and white sonogram photograph. I walked over to the spot where Donovan was still kneeling in the grass, paralyzed by shock. I dropped the sonogram picture directly onto the destroyed white orchids right next to Lexi's fraudulent DNA results. I looked down at my ex-husband, ensuring every single word I spoke echoed with absolute clarity. Donovan's sperm count was always the primary problem, I announced to the silent garden. But Vivian paid off your elite fertility doctors to completely falsify my medical records. She subjected me to 5 years of agonizing, unnecessary treatments just to protect your incredibly fragile masculine ego. She wanted me to believe I was the broken one. Donovan stared at the sonogram, his jaw trembling, his eyes filling with a fresh, horrifying wave of tears as the absolute truth finally penetrated his dense skull. But a miracle happened. I continued, my voice ringing with triumphant power. It happened the exact same week you handed me a $9 million check and threw me out into the street like garbage. My body is completely healthy. And I'm currently carrying the sole legitimate biological heir to this entire family empire. Vivian let out a strangled, agonizing sound, as if all the oxygen had been violently sucked directly out of her lungs. Her eyes bulged as she stared at the sonogram resting on the grass. I turned my gaze directly to the ruined matriarch delivering the final lethal checkmate, which means, according to the ironclad legal clauses of the grandfather's will, I am the legal guardian of the only verified blood heir. By law, I am the sole controller of the $150 million trust fund. You paid me $9 million to disappear Vivian, and I used it to legally swallow your entire legacy whole. There was absolutely nothing left to say. The utter destruction of the antagonists was completely finalized. They were left with absolutely nothing. No money, no corporate empire, no fake dignity, and no generational trust fund. They had sacrificed their actual family for a pathetic illusion, and in the end, the illusion burned them alive. Donovan let out a loud, gut-wrenching sob. He collapsed completely flat onto the grass, burying his face in the dirt, weeping for the incredible, priceless future he had carelessly thrown away. Vivian sat frozen in the pew, her face completely hollow, staring blankly into the void as the undeniable reality of her federal prison sentence and total bankruptcy finally broke her mind. I did not offer them a single word of comfort. They had shown me absolutely no mercy for 5 years, and I was entirely fresh out of forgiveness. I turned my back on the ruined altar, the smashed flowers, and the weeping men. I walked down the white carpeted aisle with my head held incredibly high. The wealthy guests physically stepped back to clear a wide path for me, looking at me with a mixture of absolute terror and profound respect. I walked straight through the heavy wrought iron gates, completely ignoring the chaotic swarm of paparazzi who were frantically snapping photos of my victorious exit. A sleek black Maybach was waiting for me at the curb, its engine purring softly. The driver quickly opened the rear door. I slid into the luxurious leather seat, letting out a long, deeply satisfying breath as the heavy door clicked shut, instantly blocking out the screaming chaos of the estate. As the car drove smoothly away from Buckhead and merged onto the highway, I placed my hand gently over my stomach. I was finally free from their toxic manipulation. I was absurdly wealthy, and I was entirely in control of my own magnificent destiny. I had walked into their den of lions completely unarmed and walked out wearing their pelts. If my journey resonated with you today, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel to hear more authentic stories of reclaiming your power and fighting back with absolute grace and strategy. Share this video with anyone who needs a powerful reminder that the people who try to bury you often forget that you are a seed. Thank you so much for joining me on this incredible journey. Keep standing tall, keep knowing your immense value, and never let anyone dictate the final chapter of your beautiful story.